All right, guys, we're going to do urinary system 1. So there's quite a bit of information in it. I'm just going to kind of get started. All right, let's start with functions of the urinary system. So first is the excretion of metabolic waste. Remember that metabolism refers to all the chemical reactions that have taken place in the body. So the waste products from those chemical reactions are going to be excreted through the urinary system. One of those waste products or byproducts is what we talked about in the last section with the digestive system. It's urea. And if you remember, this is a byproduct of amino acid breakdown. Okay. You can see that. Okay, then we have a byproduct that comes from the use of our muscles for muscle contraction, and that's called creatinine. This is not creatine. This is creatinine, okay? So again, this is our byproduct of muscle contraction. Muscle contraction is definitely a metabolic activity. Okay, and then we have something called uric acid. And this is a byproduct of nucleotide metabolism. I remember that nucleotides are the monomers for nucleic acids, which are DNA and RNA. Okay, the urinary system also helps to maintain a water-salt balance. And this, in turn, helps to kind of regulate blood pressure. So salt in the blood makes the water want to come into the blood. Again, this is one of our hypertonic versus hypotonic situations. And the salt is a solute in the blood, which makes water want to come in to kind of balance out that water-salt relationship. And then that can increase blood pressure if it dips too low. So it's going to be our increases blood pressure. I don't know if you remember, let me try that again. I don't know if you remember, but I told you in lecture that the relationship between the heart and the kidneys was a complicated one. And this is one of the reasons, because the kidneys have quite the role in blood pressure indirectly by, again, how much water is in the blood. People that are in kidney failure are put on very low sodium diets, very low salt, and that's to help keep blood pressure under control, because that helps to regulate how much water is being taken into the blood if there's not as much salt in the system. And so because of this water-salt balance and the effect it has on blood pressure, kidneys are really important in maintaining that balance. And then not only does it help with the water-salt balance, it also helps with the acid and base balance. Basically, these guys kind of act like buffers because they can excrete our hydrogen protons, which, if you remember, that's what we look for in acids, how many hydrogen protons we have. and then they can absorb our bicarbonate. So they help to kind of regulate the pH, which for our system needs to be about 7.4. Okay, very important roles here. All right, this diagram is going over all of the systems of the body and highlighting how the urinary system works with each of them, and how the urinary system works with them to maintain homeostasis. So it talks about the urinary system in relationship to the cardiovascular system, the digestive system, muscular system, nervous system, respiratory system, endocrine system, and the integumentary system. So read through that for a little bit of information on how the urinary system balances all of this. Okay, so kidneys also have a function in hormone secretion. They secrete something called renin. And this is going to help with our water-salt balance. Okay. And then it also, if you remember this from our red blood cell chapter, our EPO, erythropoietin. Remember that this is what decides if more red blood cells are needed in the system. And so the kidneys actually will regulate this, meaning that they have a huge role in how many red blood cells are being produced. RBC, red blood cells. Okay. And then all systems of the body work with the urinary system to maintain homeostasis, which is what I was showing you over here in this. All right. Let's go to the next part. Kidneys are just hugely important organs in the body. The body can function with only one. So if something happens to one, if a person is born without one, if one becomes diseased or needs to be removed, one kidney will do the work required to keep the system functioning properly, usually with no noticeable side effects, like you're fine with one kidney. Make sure we can see. All right. So let's look at the kidney a little bit closer. But first we're going to do a kind of an overall look at the organs that make up the urinary system. So there's the kidneys. In a nutshell, it doesn't begin to describe all their functions, but they are going to filter the blood to produce urine. Okay, then we have the ureters. These guys are the tubes, if you will, that transport urine from the kidneys to the bladder. So after the urine is produced in the kidneys, the ureters take that to the bladder, which is just basically a sac that is going to store that urine until it's excreted. They are made out of smooth muscle, which means we don't have control over them. And then much like we have that peristalsis, that kind of wave-like contraction movement in the digestive tract, we also have a peristaltic contraction process that's going to pull the urine from the kidneys to the bladder. This, again, wave-like contraction and release by the smooth muscles that line the ureters to move the urine down. Okay, so let's talk about the bladder. Like I said, the bladder is really just a storage sac. It stores the urine. It is made out of layers of perpendicular muscle, kind of like what we looked at with the muscularis of the digestive tract. And this allows the bladder to expand. So the arrangement of the muscle lets the bladder get bigger, so it can store varying volumes of urine before it's released. And then there's actually two sphincters that are involved here that are toward the urethra end, which we'll talk about in just a second. And those help to control the flow of urination. So they can, how do I put it? Muscle contraction helps to keep the sphincters closed. And then there are these these stretch receptors that allow the bladder muscles to contract, and at the same time the sphincters relax, and this is what releases the urine. So that's kind of an inverse thing. The muscles contract, but the sphincters relax. Okay. The urethra is this tube that transports urine from the bladder then out of the body. So in females, which is, I think, what this diagram is supposed to be showing, the urethra is short. So there's not a whole lot of it between the bladder and being able to pass outside the body. In men, the urethra is longer. Anatomically, I mean, if you think about it, the male urinary system is the same inside, but the urethra to pass from the bladder outside the body is longer than it is in women. Because of this, women tend to be more susceptible to bladder infections, because the distance to travel between the outside and up through the bladder is relatively short. So men can get bladder infections, but Most of the time, bladder infections in males is due to some other type of illness. It's not as unusual to see bladder infections in much older men. You can have the bladder infection because of a catheter use. So it can happen. It's not that it doesn't. It's just normally women are far more susceptible than men. Okay, let me see. Here and here, we good? Okay. Kidney structure. Okay, guys. So kidney structure is awesome, but it's also complicated. It's one of the more complicated organs that you will study when you get into physiology. That's because kidneys do so much. And yet, despite how much they do, they're not a huge organ. If you make a fist, that's generally the size of a healthy kidney, is about the size of your fist, and you've got one on either side. So let's go over the structure. There's three main regions of the kidney. You've got the renal cortex, and the renal cortex is this outermost layer. And then you have the renal medulla. And this is kind of these cone-shaped areas here. So they're kind of they're kind of in the middle of what's going to be the renal pelvis area, and then the renal cortex area. But notice that the cortex does extend kind of through the areas where the medulla are found. So really, if you can picture them as these cone-shaped tissues, it'll help you identify them in a diagram. Okay, and so then we have the renal pelvis. And this is the cavity of the kidney that leads directly to the ureter. So it's here, like I said, this area. And then the urine is going to move from the pelvis and down through the ureter, and then, of course, into the bladder itself. Oops. Okay, and you do have a ureter, by the way, on each side. So there's a ureter attached to the left kidney, one attached to the right kidney, and they both drain down into the same bladder. Make sure you can see everything. Okay. I'm going to point out too that we've got a renal artery, okay, pumping oxygenated blood, and then we have a renal vein, which is taking deoxygenated blood out of it. These also can play a role in blood pressure regulation in the kidney, and there's just a great deal of blood supply to the kidney because the kidney is filtering blood. So obviously we need large portals for blood to enter and then to exit after it's been filtered. Okay, so when we talk about blood flow, I mean, that's really all it needs to be said, I guess, at this point. Enters from renal artery and exits from the renal vein. I guess it's exits through the renal vein. Okay? Large amounts of blood pass through the kidney constantly to be filtered. All right, so now we're going to talk about nephrons. The nephrons are located in the renal cortex, okay, and they extend into the medulla. So these are kind of attempting to show some nephrons. They would extend down here, okay. So this is a kind of a close-up that out here you have the cortex where the nephrons start, and then in here is the renal medulla where the nephrons continue. Specifically, you have what's called the loop of Henle that's going to drop down into the renal medulla. Okay, so the nephrons are the actual location where blood is filtered and where urine is produced. So as blood passes through the nephrons, you have a variety of things happening that are drawing water out to help produce urine. And how do I put it? I mean, the blood is being cleaned and filtered at the same time then that urine is being produced, because as the blood is filtered, urine is produced. And that means that nephrons have both vascular, meaning like blood vessels, and tubular components. And the tubular components are going to be there to actually collect the urine that's being created. Okay, so let's look at the vascular components. First, we start with the afferent arteriole. And this supplies blood from the renal artery to a bundle of vessels called the glomerulus. Okay, now guys, as we progress, you'll notice that one section builds on the next. And that's what you need to try to approach really all of your science classes, kind of with that in mind. Because if you treat them just like separate sections, it's always going to kind of be confusing. If you treat the body system as a whole, then you can see how one part of the body affects another part of the body, how one system's function affects the other system's function. So, having said that, if we are looking at what we've already done with the heart and blood vessels, you should be familiar, of course, with the fact that an artery goes to arterioles that go to capillaries that come back through venules that go to veins. So some of these vocabulary terms like the afferent arteriole, the efferent arteriole, the capillary network that we're going to come across, you should know what the flow of that is and know that when you're seeing arterioles, you're looking at oxygenated blood that's flowing through and that's going to be cleaned. Okay, so try to apply your vocabulary and the things you've learned from your past lectures in this class to what we go over that's new, because it'll help you kind of connect the dots to the human system. Okay, so let's talk about the glomerulus. This is a knot of capillaries. It's because there's a lot of exchange happening here. So this is the glomerulus, this bundle right here. And because it's this bundle of capillaries, which if you remember, let's talk about it for a second. Capillaries are where oxygenated blood is dropped off along with some water. And then on the venule end, it's where we pick up some more water and waste product, okay? So in this case with the capillaries, there's a lot of exchange because the blood is being filtered here. This is where waste product is being exchanged. This is where water is being exchanged. So this is the actual site of filtration. And this process becomes a little easier to picture when you remember what's happening in capillaries and what's happening between the arterial end and the venule end of capillaries. So the blood is going to enter the afferent end of the glomerulus. or I'm sorry, this is going to enter through the afferent arteriole. The way to remember kind of this, I have two different things that I do. So A comes first in the alphabet. So I think about afferent arteriole being where it comes from. It's first. So it comes first from this part. Efferent arteriole is a little easier to remember because E is the same for efferent and also exit. So it helps you to follow the path of the blood. So it's going to enter through the afferent arteriole and it's going to exit through this efferent arteriole. So if we try to follow this diagram a little bit more, this is the renal artery, and it's going to branch off through this afferent arteriole, which is then going to filter into our capillaries. Okay, it's going to go through the filtration process, and then when it's done being filtered, it's going to exit through our efferent arteriole. Okay, so again, this is the efferent arteriole. It's going to carry the filtered blood away from the glomerulus. So afferent blood is, at this point, or afferent arterial blood is unfiltered. It's going to go through the glomerulus and then it's going to be filtered blood at this point. Okay. Make sure we can see all the way down here. Okay. So then let's look at this capillary network here. The capillaries are called the paratubular capillary network. And these capillaries are going to wind around tubes. They're going to, how do I put this? They're going to wind around the tubular components of the nephrons. Okay, so we have the glomerulus, which is its own little bundle of capillaries, and then they're trying to show here the paratubular capillary network. So it really, see how it branches off, kind of goes all different directions. So the capillaries are present all around the tubular aspects, which are there to move urine. Okay, remember that nephrons are both vascular and tubular. And so the vascular part, the capillaries, are winding around and through the tubular parts. And this is to allow for more exchange between the blood and the nephrons. It's hard to write this low, sorry. My writing's weird. Okay. All right. I feel like I need to go over, try to do a quick recap of this page because there was a lot on it and it's going to continue to be a lot on the next one. So let's remember that there's three regions of the kidney. We've got the cortex, the medulla, and the pelvis. The renal pelvis drains into the ureter, which is then going to take urine into the bladder. Then we have our nephrons. The nephrons themselves are the site at which the filtration of the blood takes place. They begin up here in the renal medulla, and then they kind of cross down into, they begin in the renal cortex, and they cross down into the renal medulla. Okay, and then we're going to look at the nephron, which has the renal artery delivering its blood into the afferent arteriole, which leads it into the glomerulus, which is this cluster of capillaries. And the cluster of capillaries is the part of the nephron where this exchange takes place. It's where the blood is actually filtered. After the blood has been filtered, it leaves through the efferent arteriole. And then we have our peritubular capillary network that is winding around under, over all of these different connections around the tubular components. Sorry guys, I'm having a hard time getting my words to come out of my mouth. All right, so what we have done from here down is the vascular component, hence the title. So now we're going to look at the tubular components, because guess what? Lots more names to remember. Okay. Make sure we can see. All right. So we've talked about the glomerulus, but now we're looking at the tubular component. So we're going to look at the glomerular capsule. And that is this kind of thing that's around the glomerulus, okay? All of this. It can be called the glomerular capsule, but a lot of times you'll hear it called this other term, the Bowman's capsule. So the glomerular capsule is going to receive the filtrate from the glomerulus, meaning the vascular part, the capillaries of the glomerulus, were just exchanging wastes and water with the blood, right? So the blood has come through. It comes through the afferent arteriole. It is unfiltered. The glomerulus filters it. And as it's filtering it, it sends it to the Bowman's capsule. Okay? So this little pouch around the glomerulus is going to receive all the filtrate that the glomerulus just produced. Okay. Now, from there, we're going to move from the Bowman's capsule up here to the proximal convoluted tubule. And convoluted is a good word for it because it goes all which directions. Okay. So while we have the blood moving from artery to afferent arteriole to capillaries to efferent arteriole, we have the filtrate now going from the Bowman's capsule up into the proximal convoluted tubule. This guy needs a lot of surface area because we're going to have some reabsorption of water here. If you are well hydrated, your body at this point is going to take more of the water that is in the blood, and it's going to keep it. It's going to reabsorb it, okay? The more dehydrated you are, the more the body has to try to conserve water, so there isn't as much to pass on into the urine. And that is why if you are dehydrated, your urine tends to be a really dark color, really dark yellow, really dark orange. That's a signal that you don't have enough water to be passing out with the other waste, the uric acid, the urea, the other wastes that come from the urinary system. So the more hydrated you are, the more clear, truly clear, almost like water, your urine becomes, because you have water that can both be reabsorbed, and then you have more water to spare that can flush out through the kidneys. Obviously, more water for the kidneys is best because you need to be able to filter all this waste out efficiently. And if you're dehydrated, there isn't enough water to help wash that out. I mean, I guess you could think about it as being like if you're trying to, I don't know, wash a car, a really dirty car, and you just kind of have a trickle coming out of your hose. That's not enough, right? You need to have a really good stream to wash a car. The same thing is kind of happening when it comes to quote unquote washing out your kidneys. You need a lot of water there to be able to make sure that all of that waste is effectively cleared out. Okay, so because we need more surface area, the inside of the proximal convoluted tubule has little like brush like extensions, almost like our little villi. So it kind of has a border of it, a brush border. For increased surface area, because we have some reabsorption here. Reabsorption happens here. Okay. All right. You with me? Bowman's capsule to the proximal convoluted tubule. Then this is the part here that's going to be dropping down into the renal medulla. Okay. This is our loop of nephron, or the loop of Henle. Again, you can hear it called the loop of nephron, but most of the time I hear it called the loop of Henle. So again, Bowman's capsule, proximal convoluted tubule, down into the loop of Henle. The loop of Henle has a descending side and an ascending side. Okay, so as we get to the loop of Henle, the urine is going to be really concentrated. So again, remember that in the proximal convoluted tubule, we've had a lot of more water absorption when there's water to spare. We've had water absorption that has been picked back up to stay in the body, and anything left that gets to be excreted, any extra, is going to come with the urine through the loop of Henle, and it just gets further concentrated because really the body is made to conserve water. Any place that it can hold on to water, it's going to, which is again why you get super dark urine if you're dehydrated. Okay. From there, we're going to come up the distal convoluted tubule. So we've come down the loop of Henle, and now we're going to head back up through this big distal convoluted tubule. Okay. Here we have a complex process of ion exchange. And this is really where we kind of have that salt balance that happens between the salt and the water, because you need to think about the sodium and the chloride ions that make up salt as these ions. So I think we're going to go into this a little bit more. I think it might be in the next section. But anyway, so this is where the ion exchange that helps with that salt-water balance is going to happen. And then finally we end up in this big guy here, which is the collecting duct. And here, this is where we have the collecting duct takes the urine and it's going to pass it to the renal pelvis and then into the ureter. And then from there we go to the ureter. Okay. All right. Okay, the next part is disorders. I'm going to try to go through this with you one more time because I know there's a lot, and I'm going to start with the blood vessel components one more time, so follow with me. I'll go all the way through. So we've got renal artery to the afferent arteriole. This is unfiltered blood that passes through the glomerulus, all these capillaries, until it is filtered. Then the filtered blood leaves through the efferent arteriole. And then we have this network of capillaries, the peritubular network, that intertwines throughout all the tubular components of the nephron. And eventually those are going to be collected and then passed back out through the renal vein, both deoxygenated and filtered. Okay, so that's the vascular part. The tubular part is going to start with our Bowman's capsule, while the filtrate is captured, that is produced by the glomerulus. It's then going to move into the proximal convoluted tubule and drop down into the loop of Henle. Proximal convoluted tubule is going to absorb more water, and the urine becomes very concentrated in the loop of Henle. Then it gets picked up here, and the distal convoluted tubule comes back up, and this is where we kind of have that salt and water regulation take place. And then it's finally dropped into the collecting duct, where it's going to be dropped into the renal pelvis, which filters or which empties into the ureter. Okay, that was fun. And remember that this loop of Henle is the part that drops down into the renal medulla from I can't think of the word, from the what is it? Geez, renal cortex. Sorry, guys. Okay, now let's look at disorders of the urinary system. So first we've got something called uremia, and this is where you have abnormally high levels of urea in the blood. Remember that urea is a waste product generated from amino acid metabolism, and so in this case we've got really high levels of it. Okay, so this can cause kidney failure, it can cause nephron damage, it can cause high blood pressure, because the kidney gets to a point where it can't filter the urea out anymore. There's so much of it, it just kind of overwhelms the kidney, and so it stops. It stops being able to function. Okay, so again, because of the complex nature of kidneys, pretty much anything that goes wrong can have in the body can have a really serious effect here. So uremia, again, in patients that are experiencing kidney failure, usually not only are they super restricted on salt, but they are phenomenally restricted on protein. Remember that amino acids are the monomers of protein, so that when you ingest protein, it breaks down into amino acids, and then amino acid metabolism produces urea. So if we need to lower the levels of urea, or at least keep them at a low level, we need to reduce protein intake. So renal patients tend to be on extremely tight, strict diets when they're in kidney failure. All right, now let's talk about kidney stones. These are made out of granules, usually of calcium or phosphate or uric acid. If you have a kidney stone and you either catch it when you go to the bathroom, or if it's taken out surgically, the doctor can analyze it to see which type of kidney stones you're dealing with. Okay, and so remember that our uric acid is the byproduct of our nucleotide metabolism. So look again at how unfiltered wastes cause issues for the kidney, and that at least when with kidney stones, some types of kidney stones, if you stay well hydrated, it prevents the buildup of those wastes from causing a kidney stone. So if a kidney stone gets large, usually it's 5 millimeters and up, it can block the ureter. And if it gets even bigger than that, it can block the renal pelvis. Because remember that our renal pelvis collects the urine and then empties it into the ureter, and the ureter's got to take it to the bladder. But if a stone gets large, it basically acts like a dam, and it blocks up the passage of urine either out of the pelvis or through the ureter. This usually causes the urine to back up into the kidney, and the kidney swells because it's just filling up with all of this fluid that's not being released. That's not only phenomenally painful, I mean, no words painful, but also generally requires surgery in order to remove the stone and stop the blockage before it destroys the kidney. And a lot of times if you have a blockage, it's not like, hey, we're going to fix this in a week. It's emergency surgery. Like right then you need to be taken in and have that done to remove that block. So can cause backflow of urine if this happens. So small kidney stones, usually the ones that are 5 millimeters or less, tend to be able to pass. The bigger they are, though, as they approach that 4 and 5 millimeter mark, it's just a crazy painful process. It just is. And it's not like once it hits the ureter, it just heads down to the bladder and is done. It can take a month for a kidney stone to work its way from the renal pelvic end of the kidney into the bladder, usually having really intense symptoms most of the way through. One of the reasons for that is because this here is an image of a kidney stone. A lot of times you think of stone and you think of like a round, smooth surfaced object. That is not what these guys look like. They look like this. They are pokey, they are stabby, they are asymmetrical. And because of that, these jagged edges, it's really easy for them to get hung up on, in part of the ureter as it's passing through. And that causes a blockage, whether it's temporary or longer. Dang, that stupid fly is back. And that's what usually causes the intense pain that's associated with a kidney stone, is when it gets hung up. Sometimes it'll still be able to clear and it'll move down the ureter. And again, sometimes if it just stays stuck, they have to go in and surgically remove it. So here's an interesting bit for how can you help pass a kidney stone. Okay, so I kid you not, guys, there's been a scientific study done on this so a number of years ago, where a nephrologist who's a kidney doctor, he took a model of a kidney. Okay, so think of like, something you'd see in a physiology lab that you can study. He took a model of the kidney and he put a bunch of different kidney stone type objects inside of it of varying sizes and at varying locations within the kidney. He then rode Big Thunder Mountain at Disneyland. Yep, Big Thunder Mountain. And found that a very large percent, I want to say like 70%, of the kidney stones actually passed out of the kidney due to all the rattling and the bumping and the jerking of that ride. Like actual published peer-reviewed scientific paper about taking that on Big Thunder Mountain. He found that if you sit towards the front of the train, if you've ever been on Big Thunder, it's a train type ride. If you sit towards the front, it had the highest number of kidney stones pass, and towards the back, it was still a significant number, but it was lower. And again, he placed them in all different parts of the kidney because kidney stones can form in the cortex and the medulla. It can form in the pelvis itself, and then they move through the kidney and down into the ureter. So anyway, how can you help pass a kidney stone? This is a little bit of a sarcastic comment because I don't know many people that would be in the middle of dealing with a kidney stone and would be willing to go through the pain caused by riding that roller coaster to help it move down. And as far as helping pass a kidney stone, there really isn't anything medically. I know some people swear by lemon juice. Some people do like olive oil and lemon juice. The lemon juice is supposed to help break up the stone because of its acidity. The olive oil is simply supposed to be a lubricant through the ureter. Really, there isn't a for sure way. I mean, I had somebody tell me once that if you drank, was it 2 cans? It was either 2 cans or 5 cans of flat Coke. It had to be flat. That it would basically turn the kidney stone into what they call gravel, which is a bunch of itty bitty pieces. Yeah, I don't know about that either. But anyway, kidney stones, good time. Okay, last page I should say. We're going to look at UTIs, or urinary tract infections, or bladder infections. Make sure, and sideways. Okay. So I told you that UTIs anatomically are far more common in women, and this is due just to women's anatomy. For men, the urethra has to pass through the penis, and so it's longer in order to do that. In women, obviously, again, it's got a much shorter distance to travel. So I'll give you some facts about this. Bladder infections, or UTIs, are generally caused by bacteria that gets kind of inadvertently swept from the vaginal area up into the urethra. And there's a variety of different types of bacteria that will cause UTIs. It requires an antibiotic to clear up. There's generally a number of things that doctors suggest for women that they can do on their side to kind of help prevent having bacteria inadvertently pushed that direction. But then if it does happen, you have an antibiotic. The thing with UTIs is if they're not treated soon enough, the bacteria actually climbs from the bladder up through the ureters and into the kidney. And then you end up with a kidney infection. And those are just as painful as having a kidney stone, except you usually have quite a fever to go with it. You're very sick. They're very serious because they too can take out kidney function. I'm going to kill that fly as soon as I'm done with this. Can cause jeez. Okay. And now we're going to look at hemodialysis. Hemodialysis is not a disorder of the urinary system, but it is a process used to treat a disorder of the urinary system. It's used to filter the blood for people that are in kidney failure. I also heard this called renal failure. Renal is referring to the kidney. Okay, so basically, the way hemodialysis, it means blood, is referring to blood. So hemodialysis is where you're hooked up to a machine. And by the way, they have gotten really small compared to what they used to be. I've had a couple of family members require this, and when I was about, 7, my grandmother, so this has been in the 80s, was on dialysis, and the machine was huge. Like in this image, you see a woman sitting here in this chair, and then this really is the unit right here. But back in the 80s, the dialysis machine was like this whole thing from floor up past the person's head was a giant machine. So now it's gotten quite small, but you attach a tube to what's usually called a fistula in your arm, and then that is circulated through the machine, which acts as a nephron, right? And it is going to filter the blood for you. And once the blood is filtered, another tube puts it back into the body. Okay? So depending on the type of renal failure the person's having, or what I should say is the cause behind it, and how severe the renal failure is at the moment, people can run 3 to 4 days a week. Some people have to run every day. Renal dialysis or hemodialysis is hard on the system. It really is, because it kind of puts your body through it more than what your own kidneys would do. We don't even notice our kidneys filtering our blood. But on a dialysis machine, you really do. And so they try to space it out at least every other day to let your body recover from the process. So I kind of went over that in words at least. Machine acts as kidney, filters the blood, and then returns it to the body. This diagram is showing how the tubes are connected. So again, this section right here on a patient is called a fistula, and it's where they go in and make a permanent access point to the major blood vessels in the arm so that they can hook the patient up to the major blood vessels. And you can see that there's a point that is hooked up for the blood to be removed for cleaning, right? This is our oxygenated blood. This is the blood that would be coming from the artery. And then we have the clean blood that's returned, and this is the part that's going to go back to the vein. Okay? The dialysis machine itself uses kind of this mix. How to put it? Really, it's stuff that's going to be effective at pulling waste out of the body, obviously without the use of the specialized parts of the nephron, but it simulates what the nephron would do in being able to effectively clean the blood and put it back in the body. That should say long. It doesn't really say anything. It sort of provides long-term access. Fistulas are crazy because you can feel your pulse, at other points in your body. You can feel the pulse of blood, but in a fistula, when you put your hand over it, you can actually feel the blood flowing. It feels like putting your hand over a thin hose. Like you feel it running through the person's arm very strongly. So it's kind of crazy. And then obviously the patient has to be careful of the fistula, because you can imagine what would happen if there were to receive a cut of any kind here, the massive amounts of bleeding that would take place. Fistulas can get blocked and then they have to be cleaned out. It's not a pleasant process. I remember it being referred to once as like having a roto-rooter come out for your plumbing system. It's kind of what happens. It's an unpleasant process to have that fistula cleaned out again in order for it to work. Okay, so I know this was kind of a longer one. Again, the kidneys are complex, and one of the harder things that you'll go through in physiology. So the more of a good foundation I can give you in this, the better it will be. So thanks for your patience.